The clock had just ticked past 3 a.m. at Dubai International Airport on December 20th, 2021. Most of the world was asleep, but inside Terminal 3, the operations center of Emirates Airlines buzzed with its usual nocturnal activity. Flight 231 to Washington Dulles was preparing for departure, a routine 14-hour journey across continents that thousands of passengers make every year without incident. But what was about to unfold would come within seconds of becoming one of aviation's most catastrophic disasters. An Emirates Boeing 777, carrying up to 354 people, would barrel down the runway at speeds far beyond normal takeoff velocity, run off the end of the pavement, become airborne at nearly 500 kilometers per hour, and then skim over residential buildings at an altitude of just 75 feet, less than the aircraft's own wingspan. Hundreds of families sleeping in their Dubai apartments that night had no idea that a fully loaded wide-body jet was screaming past their windows at a height where one small error would have sent it crashing into their homes, creating a fireball that would have killed everyone on board and countless people on the ground. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This wasn't bad weather. This wasn't a terrorist act. This was something far more insidious and far more concerning for the future of aviation safety. Automation dependency so extreme that experienced pilots apparently forgot how to fly. Emirates Airlines has built its reputation on excellence. Founded in 1985 with just 2 aircraft, the Dubai-based carrier has grown into one of the world's premier airlines, operating the largest fleet of Boeing 777 and Airbus A380 aircraft on the planet. With 153 Boeing 777s in service, Emirates is the type's biggest operator globally, using these fuel-efficient, long-range jets to connect Dubai with destinations on every continent. The Boeing 777 itself is one of aviation's great success stories. Introduced in 1995, it was the first commercial aircraft designed entirely by computer. Its safety record is exceptional. In over 25 years of service with millions of flights, fatal accidents involving the 777 have been extraordinarily rare. The aircraft is beloved by pilots for its advanced flight deck, powerful engines, and sophisticated automation systems that make it relatively easy to fly. The specific aircraft involved in this incident, registration A6 EQI, was just 4 years old, practically brand new in aviation terms. It had arrived in Dubai from Zurich 2 days earlier and had undergone all standard maintenance checks. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the airplane mechanically. Every system functioned exactly as Boeing engineers had designed it to function. Emirates' safety culture had long been considered among the industry's best. The airline has rigorous pilot selection processes, with thousands of applicants competing for a few dozen positions. Training is intensive, simulators are state-of-the-art, and the airline spares no expense on safety equipment and procedures. But beneath this veneer of excellence, cracks were beginning to show. Cracks that would nearly result in catastrophe on this December night. Because Flight 231's journey to Washington, D.C. would take over 14 hours, the flight carried 4 pilots, 2 to operate the departure from Dubai and initial cruise, and 2 relief pilots who would take over at some point mid-flight to give the first crew rest. This crew augmentation is standard on ultra-long-haul flights and actually enhances safety by ensuring pilots aren't fatigued. But on this night, having 4 pilots in the cockpit would only compound the mystery of what went wrong. How could 4 professional aviators, each with thousands of flight hours, each trained to the highest standards, each responsible for the lives of over 300 people, all fail to notice a critical error that would nearly kill everyone on board? The details of these specific pilots' backgrounds haven't been publicly released, which is typical in aviation incidents where investigations are ongoing or where airlines wish to protect individuals' privacy. But we can infer certain things from Emirates' hiring practices and training standards. Emirates pilots typically come from diverse international backgrounds. The airline recruits from around the world, seeking experienced aviators who often have military or other airline backgrounds. Many have flown for European, Asian, or Australian carriers before joining Emirates. They're not inexperienced rookies. These are seasoned professionals. The training they receive at Emirates is intensive, but, critically, it emphasizes one thing above all else: automation management. This philosophy would prove central to understanding what went wrong on Flight 231. To understand this incident, we need to understand one critical component of modern aircraft: The Mode Control Panel, MCP, also called the autopilot panel. This is the interface between the pilots and the aircraft's automation systems. It sits prominently in the center of the instrument panel, easily accessible to both pilots. On the MCP, pilots can set various parameters: speed, heading, vertical speed, and, most critically for this incident, altitude. When the autopilot is engaged, it will fly the aircraft to maintain these settings. Even when flying manually, pilots typically use the flight director, a visual guidance system that shows them where to point the aircraft to follow the planned flight path. The flight director appears on each pilot's primary flight display, PFD, as a set of pink or magenta bars, one vertical, one horizontal. By keeping the aircraft symbol centered on these bars, pilots can fly the exact path the automation has calculated, even without the autopilot actually controlling the aircraft. This system is incredibly useful and has contributed enormously to aviation safety. But it has one critical vulnerability: garbage in, garbage out. If the wrong information is entered into the automation will dutifully try to follow those incorrect instructions. And if pilots blindly follow the automation without checking whether its instructions make sense, disaster can result. Here's what appears to have happened with Flight 231. When the previous crew landed the aircraft in Dubai after arriving from Zurich, someone, either deliberately or accidentally, set the altitude selector on the MCP to 0. Why would anyone do this? Possibly as a way of clearing the panel after landing, similar to how you might clear a calculator. Possibly by accident while manipulating other controls. The reason doesn't really matter. What matters is that this setting, altitude 0, was left in place when the aircraft was parked. When the new crew arrived to fly the aircraft to Washington, they performed their pre-flight checks, but somehow, none of the 4 pilots noticed that the altitude was set to 0. This is stunning because checking and setting the initial altitude is a fundamental part of pre-flight procedures. It should happen when they first receive their departure clearance from air traffic control. It should be verified during the before-start checklist. It should be checked again during taxi. It should be verified one final time on the runway during the before-takeoff checklist. At any of these multiple verification points, any of the 4 pilots could have noticed the error and corrected it. But somehow, none of them did. At 3:09 a.m., Flight 231, lined up on runway 30, are at Dubai International Airport. The weather was perfect, clear skies, 21 degrees Celsius, no wind. There was no reason this shouldn't be a completely normal takeoff. The pilot flying, we don't know which of the 4 it was, advanced the throttles, and the massive aircraft began rolling down the runway. The Boeing 777's 2 engines, each producing over 100,000 pounds of thrust, accelerated the aircraft rapidly. In a normal takeoff, the aircraft would reach rotation speed, the speed at which the pilot pulls back on the control column to lift the nose and become airborne, at around 270 kilometers per hour for a 777 at typical takeoff weight. This is called VR, and it's calculated specifically for each flight based on aircraft weight, runway conditions, weather, and other factors. But Flight 231 didn't rotate at 270 kilometers per hour, kept accelerating. 280 kilometers per hour, 290, 300. The runway was passing beneath them at an incredible rate. Still no rotation. 350 kilometers per hour, 400 kilometers per hour. At this point, the aircraft was traveling at nearly 250 miles per hour on the ground, faster than many small aircraft crews in the air. The end of the runway was approaching rapidly. And still, incredibly, no one in the cockpit appeared to recognize that anything was wrong. Finally, with the runway running out, the aircraft became airborne. Not because the pilots rotated and lifted off, but simply because at 400 plus km/h, the aerodynamic forces on the wings generated enough lift to overcome the aircraft's weight even with the nose still down. The 777 essentially flew itself off the end of the runway. But here's where it gets even more terrifying. Even after becoming airborne, the pilots didn't climb. Instead, Flight 231 continued flying level at an altitude of just 75 feet above the ground, now traveling at close to 500 kilometers per hour, nearly 200 kilometers per hour faster than normal climb speed. Below them, The densely populated Dubai suburb of Dera passed by in a blur. Apartment buildings, houses, streets full of parked cars, all just feet below the belly of a massive jet aircraft screaming past at highway speed. The people sleeping in those buildings had no idea how close they came to being vaporized in a massive explosion. The explanation: why did this happen? The most logical explanation, supported by a NOTAM notice to airmen, that Emirates issued exactly 1 week after this incident, is this: because the altitude on the mode control panel was set to 0, the flight director was commanding the pilots to fly to 0 altitude, in other words, into the ground. The horizontal bar of the flight director, which normally would be pointing up during takeoff to indicate the pilots should climb, was instead sitting flat on the horizon, indicating level flight. The pilot flying appears to have been following the flight director rather than using basic airmanship. When the flight director showed level flight, they kept the aircraft level. They didn't look at their airspeed and think, "We're going 270 kilometers per hour. We should be airborne by now." They didn't look at the runway rapidly running out and think, "We need to take off now." They simply followed the pink bars on their display. Even after running off the end of the runway and becoming airborne, they continued following the flight director, which was still commanding level flight, toward the 0 altitude they'd set. This kept them skimming over buildings at 75 feet rather than climbing to safety. The pilot monitoring, whose job is specifically to monitor and cross-check what the pilot flying is doing, apparently failed to notice or speak up about any of this, and the 2 relief pilots in the cockpit also failed to notice the unfolding disaster. What finally caused them to climb? We don't know for certain, but likely one of several things. They reached the coast and lost visual reference to the ground, making them realize how low they were. Someone finally looked at the altitude indicator and realized they were still at 75 feet, or possibly a ground proximity warning system activated, though this should have activated much earlier. Whatever the trigger, someone finally took control, pulled back on the yoke, and initiated a steep climb. The aircraft climbed safely away, rejoined its planned departure route, and incredibly, continued all the way to Washington, D.C. as if nothing had happened. The NOTAM, Emirates' admission of a systemic problem. Exactly 1 week after the incident, on December 27, 2021, Emirates issued a NOTAM to all its pilots. The message was clear and alarming. Crews are reminded not to change the altitude parameter in the MCP after landing. There have been times when aircraft have had issues on takeoff after previous crews had set the autopilot altitude to 0. Let's parse this carefully. There have been times, plural, when aircraft have had issues, multiple incidents, after autopilot altitude was set to 0. This wasn't the first time this had happened at Emirates. This was a known, recurring problem. Flight 231 was apparently just the most egregious example, the one where the crew came within seconds of crashing into residential buildings. The NOTAM's phrasing, reminding crews rather than instructing them, suggests this was already supposed to be standard procedure. But clearly, the message wasn't getting through, or procedures weren't being followed, or training wasn't adequately emphasizing the importance of this check. Automation dependency, the industry-wide crisis. What happened to Flight 231 is an extreme example of a problem that aviation has been grappling with for decades. Automation dependency. As aircraft have become more automated and computerized, pilots have become more reliant on those systems and less practiced in basic hand-flying skills. But Emirates represents an extreme case. Industry insiders and pilots who have flown for Emirates report that the airline's culture emphasizes automation use to an unusual degree. Pilots are trained to use the highest level of automation available at virtually all times. Even during visual approaches in perfect weather, when many airlines encourage hand-flying to maintain skills, Emirates pilots reportedly program the approach into the flight management computer and let the autopilot fly it. The philosophy seems to be, why hand-fly when the automation can do it more precisely? And there's logic to this. Automation doesn't get tired, doesn't get distracted, doesn't make calculation errors. When properly used, it enhances safety. But there's a dark side. Pilots who always rely on automation lose their manual flying skills. More insidiously, they lose their ability to critically evaluate whether the automation is behaving sensibly. They become automation managers rather than pilots. They monitor screens rather than fly aircraft. This creates a dangerous paradox. The automation works perfectly 99.9% of the time, which builds trust and dependency. But when something goes wrong, when the automation is given incorrect inputs, or when it malfunctions, or when conditions arise that the automation can't handle, pilots who have come to depend on it are suddenly left without the skills to take over. The Flight 231 crew appears to have fallen into this trap completely. They were so conditioned to follow the flight director that they continued following it even when it was giving obviously nonsensical commands. They had apparently lost the ability to override the automation and apply basic airmanship. We're going 400 kilometers per hour on the ground, we need to take off. This automation dependency problem isn't uniform across the industry. Different airlines and different countries have very different philosophies about automation use. In the United States, airline culture generally emphasizes manual flying skills more than in many other parts of the world. American pilots are encouraged to hand fly regularly, often flying manually from takeoff up to cruise altitude, then engaging the autopilot, then disengaging it again at the beginning of descent and hand flying the approach and landing. The philosophy is that automation should be a tool to reduce workload when needed, but the fundamental skill of flying the aircraft should always be maintained. Pilots should be comfortable and proficient at hand flying in any condition. European airlines tend to fall somewhere in the middle, more automation use than American carriers, but not to the extreme degree apparently practiced at some Gulf carriers. At the extreme end, airlines like Emirates seem to treat the automation as the primary means of flying, with manual flying as a rarely used backup. This may stem from the fact that Gulf carriers operate predominantly long-haul routes with modern, highly automated aircraft. When your typical flight is 12 to 14 hours with modern automation that works flawlessly, it's easy to fall into the pattern of just monitoring the systems rather than actively flying. But this creates pilots who are out of practice, who lack confidence in their manual skills, and who have lost the intuitive feel for the aircraft that comes from regular hand flying. Long haul versus short haul. The experience gap. Emirates operates primarily long-haul routes, flights of 8, 10, 14 hours or more. This exacerbates the automation dependency problem in a specific way. Long-haul pilots simply perform fewer takeoffs and landings than short-haul pilots. A short-haul pilot might do 4 to 6 takeoffs and landings in a day, flying routes like London, Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels. Over a month, that's over 100 takeoffs and landings. Each one is practice. Each one maintains skills and keeps pilots sharp. A long-haul pilot might do 1 takeoff and landing per day, or even less if they're flying ultra-long routes that require crew rest. Over a month, that might be 15 to 20 takeoffs and landings. The vast majority of their time is spent in cruise flight, monitoring systems, managing fuel, updating weather forecasts, important work, but not actual hands-on flying. Over time, this creates a skills gap. Long-haul pilots simply aren't as practiced at the high workload phases of flight. And if they're flying for an airline that emphasizes automation use, they may go months without actually hand-flying a takeoff or landing. When something abnormal happens, like the Flight 231 scenario, they may simply not have the current skills or the muscle memory to respond appropriately. Other factors: fatigue and the 3 a.m. curse. Flight 231's departure time, 3:09 a.m., is significant. This falls squarely within what aviation medicine calls the window of circadian low, WOCL, the period between roughly 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. when human performance is naturally degraded. Even if you've had adequate sleep, your body's circadian rhythm causes alertness, reaction time, and cognitive function to drop during these hours. You're simply not as sharp at 3 a.m. as you are at 3 p.m., no matter how well rested you are. For pilots, this creates particular challenges. Their job requires sustained attention, rapid decision-making, and the ability to notice subtle anomalies. All of these capabilities are degraded during the WOCL. The 4 pilots on Flight 231 were operating during their circadian low, which may have contributed to them missing the altitude setting error during pre-flight checks and failing to recognize the unfolding disaster during takeoff until it was almost too late. The aftermath: damage, investigation, and consequences. Reports indicate that Flight 231 sustained damage during the incident, likely from the high-speed takeoff roll and possibly from debris or foreign object ingestion as it flew over buildings at extremely low altitude. When the aircraft returned to Dubai after completing its trip to Washington, it was grounded for 4 days for inspection and repairs. Initial reports suggested that all 4 pilots had been fired immediately, but this appears not to have been accurate. The actual disciplinary actions taken remain unclear, which is typical. Airlines usually don't publicize personnel decisions. What is clear is that Emirates recognized this as a serious incident requiring a systemic response. Hence, the NOTAM issued 1 week later. The airline likely conducted an internal investigation, reviewed procedures, and possibly enhanced training. But the incident wasn't reported to international aviation authorities in the way most serious incidents are. There's no publicly available accident report from the UAE's General Civil Aviation Authority, GCAA. This lack of transparency is concerning and represents a significant difference between how Gulf states handle aviation incidents versus how they're handled in places like the United States, Europe, or Australia, where detailed public reports are standard. This wasn't Emirates' first automation-related incident. The NOTAM's reference to times, plural, when similar issues occurred suggests a pattern. And indeed, Emirates has had several high-profile incidents in recent years that involved automation management problems. Emirates Flight 521, August 2016, a Boeing 777 carrying 300 people crashed during an attempted go-around at Dubai Airport. The pilots mismanaged the automation during the go-around, and the aircraft descended back onto the runway at high speed, bursting into flames. All passengers and crew evacuated, but 32 people were injured seriously, and 1 firefighter was killed when the aircraft's center wing tank exploded during the post-crash fire. The investigation found that automation mode confusion contributed to the accident. The pilots thought the autothrottle would maintain speed during the go-around, but it was actually in a different mode that wouldn't prevent the aircraft from slowing to dangerously low speeds. Other incidents. Aviation safety databases contain records of several other Emirates incidents involving altitude busts, unstable approaches, and automation-related issues, though details are often limited due to the UAE's less transparent reporting standards. The Flight 231 incident fits a troubling pattern. Highly experienced crews flying modern aircraft for a reputable airline, yet making fundamental errors related to automation management and basic airmanship. The industry-wide problem, lessons from other crashes. Emirates is far from alone in facing automation dependency challenges. Several major accidents in recent years have involved automation confusion or degraded manual flying skills. Air France Flight 447, June 2009, an Airbus A330 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean en route from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, killing all 228 people on board. The accident occurred when the aircraft's pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, iced over, causing the autopilot to disconnect. The pilots, confronted with conflicting instrument readings and flying manually in the middle of the night over the ocean, became disoriented. Despite having thousands of feet of altitude and plenty of time to recover, they entered a stall and maintained control inputs that kept the aircraft stalled all the way into the ocean. The investigation found that the crew's lack of recent manual flying experience and poor understanding of the aircraft's flight envelope contributed to their inability to recognize and recover from the stall. Asiana Flight 214, July 2013, a Boeing 777, the same type as Flight 231, crashed short of the runway at San Francisco International Airport, killing 3 and injuring 187. The crew was attempting a visual approach and had disconnected the autopilot and autothrottle. But they became confused about which automation modes were active and believed the autothrottle would maintain approach speed. It didn't, and they didn't notice the aircraft slowing dangerously until it was too late. The aircraft struck a seawall short of the runway. Turkish Airlines Flight 1951, February 2009, a Boeing 737 crashed short of the runway at Amsterdam, killing 9 people. The autopilot, responding to a faulty radio altimeter reading, began reducing thrust, believing the aircraft was about to land when it was actually still hundreds of feet in the air. The pilots didn't notice until the aircraft had slowed dangerously and entered a stall from which they couldn't recover. In each of these cases, automation played a role, either through malfunction, mode confusion, or over-reliance. And in each case, the crew's degraded manual flying skills or poor understanding of automation modes contributed to the disaster. The training challenge. How do we fix this? Aviation authorities and airlines worldwide have recognized automation dependency as a serious threat, but fixing it is challenging. Some measures being implemented include enhanced manual flying training. Many airlines now require pilots to hand fly more often and practice manual flying scenarios in the simulator more frequently. But this is difficult to mandate on regular flights. Passengers and airlines want the smoothest, most efficient flights possible, which automation provides. Automation mode training. Better training on understanding what the automation is doing, what mode it's in, and when it will or won't perform certain functions. This is particularly important for modern aircraft with complex flight management systems. Scenario-based training. Simulators now include more scenarios where automation fails, is misconfigured, or gives incorrect guidance, forcing pilots to recognize the problem and take over manually. Culture change. Perhaps most importantly, airlines need to shift from a culture of always use maximum automation to one of use automation as a tool, but never lose basic flying skills. This requires buy-in from management, training departments, and line pilots. But changing culture is slow and difficult. Airlines have ingrained ways of doing things, and pilots have ingrained habits formed over thousands of hours of flying. Changing these requires sustained effort and leadership commitment. The question of oversight and transparency. One concerning aspect of the Flight 231 incident is the lack of transparency. In the United States, any incident this serious would be investigated by the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and would result in a detailed public report with findings and recommendations. In Europe, similar processes exist, but the UAE's aviation safety reporting is far less transparent. The GCAA exists and does conduct investigations, but detailed public reports are rare, and the culture of openness that characterizes aviation safety in Western countries is less developed. This matters because aviation safety depends on learning from incidents and sharing those lessons globally. When incidents are kept quiet or details aren't shared, the entire industry loses opportunities to learn and improve. The fact that Emirates issued a NOTAM suggests they recognized the seriousness of Flight 231, but a NOTAM is an internal communication. What lessons might other airlines learn from this incident? What systemic factors contributed? What specific recommendations might prevent similar incidents elsewhere? Without a detailed public investigation, we may never know. What should have happened? The checklist culture. Aviation is famous for its checklist culture. The idea that critical procedures shouldn't rely on memory, but should be systematically verified using written checklists. This culture has saved countless lives by ensuring important steps aren't forgotten. Flight 231's crew should have caught the altitude error at multiple points. After receiving clearance, when ATC gave them their initial departure clearance, including their cleared altitude, they should have set that altitude on the MCP and verified it was set correctly. Before start checklist includes verifying the MCP settings. After start/taxi checklist, another verification opportunity. Before takeoff checklist, final verification that all systems, including the MCP altitude, are correctly configured. At any of these points, any of the 4 pilots should have noticed the 0 altitude setting. The fact that they apparently didn't suggests one of several possibilities. They rushed through checklists without actually looking at what they were checking. They called out checklist items without actually verifying them. They assumed someone else had checked it. They looked at it but didn't consciously register that 0 altitude was wrong. All of these represent serious breakdowns in crew resource management and checklist discipline. Fundamentals of safe flying that should be automatic for experienced airline pilots. Conclusion: a warning for the future. Emirates Flight 231 represents a close call that should serve as a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. The fact that 4 experienced pilots, flying a modern aircraft for a premium airline, in perfect weather conditions, came within seconds of crashing into residential buildings because they were blindly following automation is deeply troubling. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't unavoidable. This was preventable at multiple points through basic airmanship, proper checklist discipline, and appropriate use of automation. The incident exposes several systemic issues, Excessive automation dependency that causes pilots to lose basic flying skills and judgment training cultures that emphasize automation management over airmanship long-haul operations that give pilots fewer opportunities to practice takeoffs and landings crew resource management failures where multiple people can witness something going wrong without speaking up lack of transparency in some regions that prevents the industry from fully learning from incidents. If aviation is to maintain its exceptional safety record as aircraft become more automated, these issues must be addressed. The solution isn't to eliminate automation. Automation has made flying safer in many ways. But pilots must remain pilots, not just automation managers. They must maintain the skills, judgment, and confidence to take over when automation fails or is misconfigured. The 354 people on board Flight 231 were incredibly fortunate that night. Through luck or last-minute recognition of the danger, they survived what could easily have been a catastrophic crash. The residents of Dubai's Dera neighborhood were equally fortunate, sleeping through what could have been a disaster that killed hundreds. Next time, we might not be so lucky. The question is whether the industry will learn the lessons from this near-miss before the next one turns into an actual disaster. The answer to that question may determine whether aviation's remarkable safety record continues or whether we're heading for another preventable tragedy. The pink bars on the flight director are meant to guide, not command. The automation is meant to assist, not replace judgment. And ultimately, despite all the technology, despite all the automation, despite all the computerization, someone in the cockpit still needs to be actively flying the airplane. Emirates Flight 231 showed us what happens when that fundamental principle is forgotten. Let's hope the lesson is learned before it's too late.